Good morning.
Good morning.
Awaken you who sleep. Rise from the dead, and the Christ will bring you light. These are words from Paul in the letter to the Ephesians, a congregation in Ephesus. And I think they are very proper for our contemplations today because it is Sunday morning. And I know that all of you have a choice. You could have stayed home today rather than coming here and exercising your spiritual muscles. So I am very grateful that you are here today to do that, because it's always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for the kind invitation. I like to start by saying that it's truly touching and motivating to be able to talk to folks and see firsthand that they're trying to do exactly the same thing that I'm trying to do on the other side of the country, which is to be better a little bit every day. So thank you so much for being here and for continuing to do that. Today I would love to chat with you a little bit about our road to Damascus, about Paul's journey to Damascus and how that may be symbolic to our own lives today. And if you are anything like me, you might be sometimes a little hesitant to think that these stories of people we have not met with strange names 2,000 years ago might not always be that relevant to our modern lives. But I beg to differ. And my hope today is to share with you a little bit of our thinking around the symbolic journey that Paul took and can be applied to our lives too, as he left Jerusalem to Damascus. And we think that that road is a very, very symbolic one, like I said, a very spiritual one. And I hope that we can translate his trip into our own life's work and see if that aligns a little bit. Does that make sense? I won't babble for too much, don't worry about it. Hopefully we'll have a little bit of time in the end to exchange ideas. But before anything else, I think it's very important for us to share a little bit more about who was Paul. I think that we all know Paul, the apostle. And sometimes we might not know that he was considered the apostle of the Gentiles. That means everybody who was not Jew. So he took on his life's work to go out and talk about the Christ and the gospel of the Christ, but the good news to all those who were not Jewish at that time. And that might seem like an interesting or anecdotal idea in general for us. However, we also need to consider that there was an early debate right after Christ had left us of whether you needed to be a Jew first before becoming a Christian. Because you might remember Paul and Christ, they were Jews. And so a debate ensued afterwards of whether you needed to go to the rites of passage through Judaism before you could then study the Christ, such as circumcision and so forth and so forth. And there was an early debate about what should happen. We don't think about that very much today because I think that in large part to the great work of Paul, we have been able to hear of the message of the Christ outside the need to go first to the Jewish law. But anyway, so he's a really central figure for anything that we know about Christianity, and I venture a guess that the Christianity we know today is because of Paul, because he has been able to get the word out to all the different peoples, and eventually we see the Gospels by Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John coming about, and those were in Greek, so they were really found outside of Jerusalem, the scholars, when they retranslated and so forth. And so he's been a really big presence, a really big looming presence in Christianity in general for all of us. So much so that if you think about the New Testament, we generally think is like the Bible is divided in between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament being all the laws and the prophets before Christ, and the New Testament, this new message of the Christ. We always think it about like one book or one thing, but when we read it more closely, we notice that the New Testament is actually 27 different books. 4 of them are the Gospels, like I said, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. One of them is called Acts of the Apostles, which is really what happened after Christ left. Immediately afterwards, there was a lot of mediumship going on, a lot of phenomena taking place. And then there's also, of course, the Apocalypse, right? So there's these 6 books, and then 21 of the 27 are letters. Are letters that the different apostles and the different disciples of Christ wrote back and forth to the different congregations, because it was really hard to get there. We didn't have WhatsApp, Netflix, or internet, and so it was really hard for us to get ourselves entertained and hear messages going back and forth. So they wrote letters. And Paul is credited with writing 13 out of the 27 letters. So you can understand how much of his influence is in what Christianity we have today. He was also out there getting the word out, right, to folks like we talked about. So if we look at an ancient map here of all the travels that Paul did at that time, it's truly fascinating, where he started right over here and he kind of walked his way up to Asia Minor, right, which is Cappadocia, which is Turkey. Here is Greece, right? He went all the way, here's Greece, sorry, up even to Macedonia, and of course ended up his life in Rome. So, and he did this a couple of times, so it's quite a feat and quite an accomplishment when you're thinking that he's doing this by walking and sometimes by boat. It takes a while. So it's an incredible life dedicated to helping others and sharing the word of Christ, which is a calling to spirituality and to awakening. So when we look at the figure of Paul, he looms large in the pantheon of Christianity. It's a figure that is everywhere, and sometimes I feel it's hard for us to even relate to these historical figures on that perspective, because they seem so incredible and so fantastic and so spiritual in so many different ways, that it's almost like it is an unreachable thing to do. It's something that normal people couldn't do it. But what's important to notice, and I think this is a beautiful moment for all of us, that before Paul was Paul, he was first Saul. He was born Saul of Tarsus, Tarsus being the city in which he was born and he lived, and as it was a custom of the time, you related to people as where they were coming from. So Saul was born within the Jewish faith, a very bright man, young, very driven, who quickly rose to the ranks of Judaism at the time, and eventually made his way to the Sanhedrin, which was the largest body of law of the Jewish tradition. And that sounds interesting to us, but if we take into consideration that in Jerusalem at the time, there wasn't a distinction between religion and the actual law of the land, that they were both of them together, you can understand how big of an accomplishment this is. So he was young, he was a big defender of his faith, and at a really early age, with a great gift for reason and logic and an incredible drive and love for the message of God, he ascended to the highest levels of the Jewish tradition, where he heard about these people who were preaching that a strange man from Galilee was doing great things. And as these people began to talk about Christ and the idea of the Christ as the promised Messiah that was envisioned in the Jewish tradition came to be more and more prevalent, Paul and others began to worry of whether the Jewish people was being led astray by somebody or somewhere else who was not holding steadfast to the Jewish law. So as a driven young man with career plans and the desire to do well, he started to persecute these early Christians. And when we mean persecute, we really mean persecute. He was the harshest and most violent voice against the early Christian disciples and preachers. And he went out and arrested them and set in motion many different things that led to very unfortunate outcomes to a lot of folks. So it's really interesting for us to see that before he was perhaps the greatest proponent of Christianity, he was first its greatest detractor. And that transformation is a really incredible one. It's a complete 180, a turnaround in what his life was like to what it became. Where in the beginning he was driven by fame and a great love for the laws and the institutions of the time, by the time that he leaves his physical body, he's completely devoted to the idea of spirituality, Christ, and no longer places material fame and need above his need for personal and fulfillment. So that transformation in itself is an incredible one that should inspire us. But what I think is more marked about his existence, and perhaps more interesting to us, is how it came about, because it was also an exceptional one. You see, to tell you a little bit about that, I'm going to ask for your indulgence to just tell you very poorly about his actual trip from Jerusalem to Damascus as interpreted by my ideas on what we read in this amazing book, Paul and Stephen, that if you haven't had a chance to read, I highly recommend it. It's this thick, but it's this worth it. And it's an incredible book. And what we find in this book, written by the Spirit of Emmanuel as he recounts the story of Paul, is that as Paul had ascended up, he was a very dedicated man. He fell in love with this wonderful, sweet soul, Abigail. And as he was driven to do everything that he wanted in his professional and religious life, she seemed to be his rock, and they were really getting ready to marry. What we don't know, or what he didn't know, is that she had been estranged from her brother. And she longed to find her brother, and actually asked for his help to find her brother, because her brother, she says, would really like Paul, because they were both devoted to God in the most sublime way. Fast forward many different incidents, and we find that her brother has actually, for a myriad of events, converted into Christianity and has become one of its greatest earlier proponents, and his Christian name becomes Stephen. And it turns out that unknowingly, Paul begins to persecute early Christians in Jerusalem, whose one of the greatest proponents is Stephen. By a turn of events, he actually orders the stoning of Stephen without knowing that it was his loved wife's brother, which they find out after he has been stoned and before he passes. At that moment in time, taken by all of that and thinking that he could not be associated with a woman whose brother was Christian, he breaks off his engagement even though he dearly loves her, because his ego gets in the way. And goes into severely persecuting the Christians again. And as time goes on, eventually he goes back and tries to make amends with her and finds out that she's dying. And before that she passes away, she tells him that she too has converted to Christianity. And that is a stab in his back as well. And he's split between, how can that be, the woman that I love, converting to this awful cult, which they really thought Christianity was. Was it not enough that I killed her brother? He's already conflicted about that. He was an early Christian, and she has transformed into a Christian as well. And he's told that a kind man would visit her, and his name was Ananias. And because of that, she converted. So now he's angry about this guy too. And so he feels that he's going to channel all his pain and his frustration into persecuting this guy. And so he leaves. He leaves Jerusalem and goes to Damascus for that reason. And that's what really interests us. As he's leaving Jerusalem to the road to Damascus, you might remember there were no cars at the time. It's a long, long road, and it's not a beautiful and exciting road like we imagine today. There are no 7-Elevens along the way. There are no gas stations. It's really desert like this. This is an actual shot of that area. So he feels dizzy. He falls off his horse onto the ground. And as he's trying to get his bearings, he sees the presence of this incredible light that comes to him. And it's something overwhelming which he has not yet seen. And he realizes it is Christ that has come to him. And the Christ comes to him and asks him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And at that point, he's taken by such an incredible and overwhelming feeling, realizing who Christ was. That he wasn't indeed the vain leader of a cult, but instead the promised Messiah. And in a very courageous way, he turns to Christ and asks, Christ, what would you have me do? And Christ then tells him that he's still to go to Damascus and wait for more instructions. He comes back to his senses and realizes that his friends around him have not been part to this phenomena. And they think that he has gone mad, that maybe he has so much sun in his head from the road in the desert, that he's not feeling well, as it often happens to those who travel those lands. And worried as they are, they say, well, let's get him back to Jerusalem. Let's make sure that he gets to the doctor. But Paul, in a moment of great spiritual presence, says, no, I have to go to Damascus. So the three of them are, how do we do this with the boss? Should we take him back? Should we go forward? So the two young ones, Demetrius and Jacob, decide to make their way back to Jerusalem and let them know what has happened, and that the greater exponent of Judaism at the time wants to go to Damascus because he has seen the Christ and he has converted to Christianity. Big deal. The wiser companion, understanding that Paul won't budge and caring for Paul, decides to take him to Damascus and make sure he gets there, because there's a kicker here. Paul was also blind. After he has the vision, he can no longer see. So imagine a wandering man walking through the desert. That's not going to go very well. So afraid for his life, he goes to Damascus. And as he gets to Damascus, they try to find a friend of Paul that would take him in. And as he's telling his friends about what happened, of his vision of the Christ and how he's really taken by them, they shut his doors on him, because they weren't really his friends to begin with. They were friends, but in a professional manner. And they're worried that his new views on life are going to affect their standing in the community. So they don't want anything to do with them. So what it turns out is they end up putting him on his friend Jonah puts him on a little bed and breakfast, right? Basically, which was what you had at the time. No Hiltons, no Marriotts, right? Puts you in there, pays a little bit for that, and calls for a doctor and all that good stuff. But now his friend is also starting to get a little worried, because, oh my goodness, I am now with Paul, who's telling people that he really likes the Christ. And so he likes his friend, but at the same time, he had nothing to do. I don't want anything to do with this. Paul understands this and asks him to go and lets him go. So Paul is left by himself, blind, in a Motel 6 in Damascus, waiting for somebody to come and help him. He doesn't know what that is, and he's got no money. A difficult situation to be in. Guess who shows up a day or two later to help him? Ananias, the very man he was persecuting, who himself had a encounter with the Christ, who told him that he should go to that place and heal Saul at the time. Can you imagine the conversation, too, by Ananias and the Christ? I can imagine saying, Christ appears, Ananias taken by devout feelings of glory and everything else, and Christ says, go to that place, find Saul and heal him. And he might be like, Lord, are you sure we're talking about the same guy here? Is this the guy that's been going around and having people killed? Do you really want me to go there and do this? And he does. And so you can see the faith and the belief that Ananias had to go there. He goes to Saul, finds him there, talks to him, prays to him, and as he's basically giving him passes, it is, as you know the story, as if scales fall from Paul's eye and he sees again. And Paul is even more sure of what's happening. He decided he's going to now tell people about his Christian faith. And the rest is, proverbially, history. As we find our way there, I think that what's really symbolic of Paul's trip to Damascus, that he was in a group, but he was alone. While he was going to Damascus and he had his vision, he had 3 friends and 3 acquaintances near him that were literally walking beside him as he has this encounter with the Christ in his vision. But yet, none of them could either hear or see the Christ. And I think the symbolism in that is deep. It's deep because I also wonder if we find ourselves in our lives called to do a change, called to awaken to our spirituality. And we find ourselves amidst a group, be it our family, be it our friends, but not everybody receives that call at the same time. So even though you have friends and families that are with you, you oftentimes will feel alone when it is time for you to face an important change in your life. And when that happens, we ought not to feel abandoned, but instead understand that the calling is personal. It is for us and not for a group of people at the same time. What other people do or do not do is something that's beyond our control. It is for us to decide and understand that we need to go through that process. And that is a really hard truth. Because when you are with people you love, you want them to like the things you do. You want them to have the best that there is. But they don't always see it like you do. And it's okay. And we must also understand by the same example that some of those people, when we are called to do a change in our lives, might temporarily leave us to go back. Few of them might come to us to where we want to go. And that's something that we too must internalize and be okay with. Because we cannot force anybody else to change. We just can operate the changes in our own hearts. So I think that is a beautiful awareness, that it's a really hard one. But we say this so that you don't feel like you're the only one going through that when it happens to you. It happens to everybody. And everybody must act on it. So that's one beautiful symbolism that we see from Paul's trip. If we continue our road to Damascus, we'll see that the second symbolism here is that he has a destabilizing meeting with the Christ. We oftentimes think that when we make this decision or when we are prepared to do this big change, there will be angels playing in the background, the sky will open, the sun will go down, the angels will come, harps will be playing, and it will be a beautiful moment where we will have so much clarity and certainty that we will know for sure that that's the change we ought to do. But you see from Paul's example that he actually met the Christ when he was least expecting. And it's such a shock to his system that he literally falls off the horse. And he doesn't know what's happening. And in a way, I feel like life knocks at our door sometimes and forces us to see things or do things when we are least expecting. And it completely destabilizes. It literally knocks us off our feet, emotionally and spiritually. And the process of change, it's often hard. And especially for meaningful change, it is really hard. I say this so that we perhaps can work on our expectations that any great changes in our lives will be a magnificent moment of clarity and purpose. Oftentimes, it is not. Oftentimes, life comes to us and completely lays to ruins our plans. And if you feel like you had plans for your life and they've been shaken up, do not feel like things are not going okay. Just make new plans and move forward. So this stabilizing meeting is a really interesting piece because it ought to remind us that we are going to find situations that are difficult for us to handle, and those are the really important ones. And I think, in a way, that is a great symbolism that we can also take from Paul's trip. As we continue our road here, our third piece to this is the courageous question. You see, when Paul has this vision with the Christ, and the Christ asks him, why are you persecuting me? Paul could have easily launched into the diatribe and say, no, really, I was defending the law. No, I was following my heart. or I'm sorry, that's not really what I meant to do, now I see what's wrong, right? There's many different ways in which we could have played this out. We could have had that conversation. He could have justified himself, but he didn't. With incredible courage, he understands that he needs to change, that he wants to change. And he asks a very courageous question. He says, "What would you have me do?" Isn't that beautiful? It's incredibly courageous. His personality was one of incredible courage all the time. But even when faced with the fact that he has been on the wrong side of history, instead of dwelling too much on what has been, he knows that he needs to take arms and work on what could be. And that is a beautiful awareness for us, because we often get trapped in analysis paralysis. We often get trapped in pity and wallow in it for a while. The example of Paul is that we shouldn't really do that. We should try to find meaning when these situations come to us and ask for guidance, because we can have it. And he gets an answer. Go to Damascus. He's not sure why, but he gets a partial answer. And in life, oftentimes, we're also not going to get a full answer of what is it that we're going to do. We've maybe been spoiled by our GPSs, where we put the final destinations and we get a whole turn-by-turn plan on how we need to get there. But life oftentimes is not like that. Life oftentimes is waypoint navigation. It is go to the next street and make a right. And when you get there, you get more directions, you figure it out where you go next. So it's also important for us to take it from our shoulders if it's heavy. The idea that we ought to have everything known and figured out. We don't. We just have to have the direction, the general direction of where we want to go. The rest, we can figure it out on our way, as Paul did. And that is, I think, the third symbolism that we can easily expand more, but just want to make sure that we run through them. And as we go on our road to Damascus, the fourth symbolic moment here is his temporary blindness. After he sees the Christ, he doesn't attain spiritual wisdom. He's shaken up to his core, and he cannot see anymore. He cannot see where he's going on the road. How emblematic of us when we are hit hard by a change in our lives. We may not lose our physical sight, but we are often disoriented. We don't know where to go next. And that temporary blindness continues with us for a while. It takes a while for us to get our bearings after we are knocked down on our butts by life. And that's okay. And that also is, in a way, reassuring if you are going through a tough time. Because you don't always, again, have to have it all figured out. You can understand that for a moment, you might struggle knowing what to do. The trick, however, is to decide what you're going to do next. And that takes us to our fifth part here, which is very courageously, he decides, blind and almost alone, to move forward. He could have easily decided to go back to Jerusalem. That's where he lived. He could go back and reassess. He could go back to his comfort zone and saying, I'm going to think this through. I just had an incredible experience. I don't know what to make of this. I'm going to retreat into my home, my heart, my mind, and I'm going to figure this out and give myself time in the comfort of my old ways. But he does not. In that moment, when he's faced with that change, he's again very courageous, and he decides to go to Damascus, even though his friends and companions are urging him to do what? To return to Jerusalem, to go back to his old self, to get his bearings in his old life and his old way of thinking and his old way of being. But he knows now in his heart, because it was such an important experience he had, that he has to move forward even if he cannot see where he's going. And that is inspiration to all of us. That oftentimes we have to make this decision, even when we don't know where to go. We have to decide to move forward, whatever that might take us. It takes us courage. It takes a lot of courage, but it pays off. But we must make that decision. And again, it might run contrary to what those around us might want us to do. And that, I think, is the fifth symbolic moment there that we can take away for our own lives as Paul goes through. And if we go to the sixth, we also see that much to our delight, even though we forget, we get unexpected help. He didn't know that Ananias was going to show up and heal him. He wasn't expecting it. When he was in his most vulnerable moment in his life, somehow the mercy of God materializes and he has help from a person who he least expected when he first set foot that he would have help from. It is an incredible moment of awareness for all of us that even when we are downtrodden, even when we are hurt and feeling the blues, even when we feel like we've been abandoned, blind, we have nothing to our names and forgotten in a corner of the world which is not ours, God is with us. It fills me with joy to think about this. That a messenger will come to us. Somebody we least expect might show up, and that we need to be open to it. And sometimes I wonder, had he not lost his vision, would he have been helped by Ananias? Would he have taken the help? So sometimes it takes losing our vision to be able to see better. And that is an incredible moment for our hearts. Let us let our armor fall to take the message in. And that is a beautiful, beautiful moment. The seventh moment, and the realization here, I think, of the road to Damascus is that he arrived at a different Damascus. He's going to the same place, and he ends up in the same geographical place that he planned to go. Yet, the Damascus in which he arrives, I think you can agree with me, is vastly different than the one he thought he was going to reach. He thought he was going to go into the gates of Damascus as a defender of the faith, a person in control with power, and he was going to do great things, persecuting the men and all these believers of this emerging cult he believed Christianity to be. It's the same place, but because his mindset has changed, because his spiritual view has changed, the Damascus that he arrives in, although it is the same city, holds a vastly different meaning to his heart. He arrives not as the champion of the Sanhedrin, but instead as a wandering, abandoned, blind man with nothing to his name, who actually needs to receive help from strangers because his friends won't take him in. So I wonder if the symbolism of Damascus to us is also a really important one. That the places we think we want to go to might not be the places that we need to go to. And the mindset that we have about the world that we think are the ones that are going to lead us to success and prosperity might not be the ones who truly lead us to happiness. If we abandon our old ways of thinking, our mindset of importance only to the physical things, then we might be able to let in our hearts sprout a new joy when we shed away our ego to let spirituality come in. But when it does, it changes things profoundly and is extremely, extremely hard. So Paul's Damascus, in which he thrives, by the way, when he is healed by Ananias and he meets the Christians, we are told in that wonderful book I told you, which deserves a reading if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, that he finds a sense of communion and kinship with the early Christians in Damascus who help him, who take him in, who teach him about the Christ and all the passages which he has not yet had a chance to read. There is an early gospel, the Gospel of Levi, that is written in pieces of parchment and leather. He gets a copy of that and he starts to study that, and he learns anew in this new Damascus about God in ways that all his learning from before had not afforded him. It is beautiful, it's humbling, and it is absolutely shocking and different. So, even though this trip, this simple trip that it seems that a man took 2,000 years ago from one place to the next, can hold a lot more meaning than we expect, the question that remains is, what is our Damascus? What is it that we want to do with our lives? What is it that we're seeking to do in our lives? Where are we going and to what end? And as we go down the road, like Paul did, of our lives, we can expect to be together with people, but it won't be surprising if we find ourselves sometimes alone, with time for contemplation. It does not mean that those around us do not love us. It doesn't mean that. It just means that we have to spend time with ourselves to figure it out who we are and what we truly stand for. And when we do that, we may have a destabilizing meeting with our destiny. One that requires us to change fundamentally everything about us. And more importantly, the way we think about life. One with different priorities. Have we been called to that? Have we been met with the idea of spirituality and the need to change some perspectives on our minds so that we can find the happiness that we want? If we truly want happiness, are we prepared to let go of the old ways, to take in our heart the Christ? Is there space in your heart for Christ, for that vision in Damascus? Even though it will knock you off your feet sometimes and have you struggle. And it will even make you temporarily blind to the things of the world afterwards. Is there space in your heart to make the decision to go ahead even though all of this is happening? And is there space in your mind to take the unexpected help that will come as well? Are you prepared? And are you really ready to listen to what the universe offers you? Because it may come from all different places. Be open. Embrace it. Who will be your Ananias? Who is the person that will help you shed your temporary blindness to the things of the physical world? Who will help you realize that you are far more than your physical body? Who will help you so that you can get in touch with your own heart? That is the calling through the ages. The Christ has been calling us to awaken to a world that is the same like Damascus was, but that is not. That we can be in this world without being of this world. That happiness is not of this world, but it can be in this world. Isn't it, after all, what we ask to be done when we do the Lord's Prayer and say, Lord, bring your kingdom into this kingdom. May your will be done in heaven as it is here. We are the ones that we've been waiting for. We are the ones who are going to transform this planet in our own lives. We will have help, but the decision is ours. And we have a wonderful tool in which to do this, because Spiritism offers this awareness of life immortal through the communication with the spirits and the certainty that our essence lives on after our physical body, so that we may be assured of the example that Christ set for us 2,000 years ago when he was killed, but he came back to life. His resurrection, it's another symbol that we too will outlast this physical life. The most important piece, nugget of his message, in my humble view, is the fact that he came back to life to show us that there is no death. And that transforms us. Transforms us in our thinking, as Paul was transformed when he realized that. Because that awareness oftentimes doesn't just come with our intellects. It comes with our hearts. Paul was incredibly smart, quick, and wise in many ways. He was the bearer of an potent intellect. But it was only until he was confronted with the truth, emotionally, with the presence of the Christ, that it was personal to him, it was that he decided to change. So get close. Get close to your discomfort. Get close to the things that you feel are important, and feel them too. Don't just think about it. And when we do, I hope that you may be touched by this incredible message. Because if the story is about Paul, and he really means all of us, we must not forget that at the helm of it all is our older brother, the Christ, who has told us that in the Gospel of John, the most mystical of the four Gospels, that he is the resurrection and the life, that his teachings, not his persona, but his ideas, representation of God's supreme will, he is the resurrection and the life. And whoever believes in these teachings and knows that there is immortality, even though their physical body will die, they as spirits will live forever. You may also reach the levels of joy and happiness that this incredible soul that lived 2,000 years ago, who radically transformed himself, as a token of what we can do to our lives if we decide to change too. So I hope from the bottom of my heart that whatever journey you're in, whatever problems that you are facing, you might be reminded that you're not alone, that there is a way forward, and it's only a matter of time until you reach a beautiful destination. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart. I wish you the best, and I hope all but the glory of God to all of you. Thank you.